Hello, my name is John Powell. Myself and Josie and Alice and Kenneth are the yes group to Does solitary confinement constitute cruel and unusual punishment? Starting out, what is solitary confinement? It's when inmates spend 23 hours of every day locked in a small prison cell with fluorescent lighting that is never turned off and no windows to see outside. Communication with other inmates and staff is highly restricted. Inmates also rarely receive reading materials. In the 1960s, the hands-off doctrine was presented to corrections law. It assumed because correction officials were viewed as the experts in penal policy, the courts should hold off to their judgments. During the 1960s and the 1970s, conditions in solitary confinement programs in multiple state prisons were held to violate the Eighth Amendment forbidding cruel and unusual punishment. Hutto v. Finney in 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state of Arkansas has a 30-day maximum limit in solitary confinement. In the United States, there are different names used for solitary confinement. The first is disciplinary or punitive segregation. This type of confinement is used to punish inmates who violate facility rules. A hearing is commonly held, and if found guilty, the inmate will serve a term in confinement. The second, administrative segregation. This is used for inmates believed to be gang members or if the inmate is viewed as a risk to safety or security to the facility. This is used even if no violation has been identified. The third is protective custody. It is used to remove inmates that can be viewed to be a risk or harm or abuse in general population. Individuals with mental illness, transgenders, or even former law enforcement officers are placed in this type of segregation. And finally, the fourth, temporary confinement. It's commonly used for segregating housing when an incident is under investigation. And physical and cognitive effects. In 2012, Colorado Department of Corrections conducted a study that found prisoners spent on average 19 and a half months in isolation. Some of these prisoners were sent to isolation for assaults on staff or other prisoners, and the others were there because of gang or drug-related activity. The study also showed mental illness was 10% higher in isolation compared to general population. Solitary confinement was associated with the increased risk of self-harm. Inmates were 3.2 times as likely to commit self-harm per 1,000 days at some time during their incarceration compared to those who never spent time isolated from general population. Out of 89 incarcerations, there were 103 acts of potentially fatal self-harm. The most common methods of self-harm were laceration, ligature, swallowing foreign objects, and possible overdose. Inmates attempting to inflict self-harm forces staff to have physical contact with prisoners. Some of the physical and cognitive effects researchers have discovered. The consequences of solitary confinement include the result of sensory deprivation. Dr. Michael Zygmunt, a University of Pittsburgh professor in neurology, states isolation devastates the brain. There is no question about that. Without air, we will live minutes. Without water, we will live days. Without nutrition, we live weeks. Without physical activity, our lives are decreased by years, and social interaction is part of these basic elements of life. By not having social interaction, being in solitary confinement, it creates stress hormones that can make dramatic changes to the hippocampus part of the brain. The hippocampus controls how our senses are translated to the rest of our brain. Stress hormones have been shown to rewire the brain. Hormones can affect the hippocampus on individual space perception and directional positioning. The internal GPS of the brain is disturbed and depth perception is altered. Some side effects on long-term solitary confinement creates harmful psychological side effects such as visual and auditory hallucinations, hypersensitivity to noise and touch, insomnia, paranoia, feelings of rage and fear, loss of sense of time and perception of reality, thoughts of suicide, and PTSD. It should be known juveniles and those who suffer from mental illness are more prone to these side effects due to the brain still developing in juveniles and the chemical imbalances in those with mental disorders. Some ineffectiveness side effects: skills to associate with others and skills on how to deal with emotions are lost after serving long sentences in solitary confinement. This makes it difficult when a prisoner is placed back into general population or even released back into society. Some homosexuals, transgenders, or even ex-law enforcement prisoners are placed into isolation for their own protection, but many come out worse off than they were going in. No studies show that solitary confinement actually reduces violence. It has been considered cruel and very counterproductive. Prison is supposed to be a tool to rehabilitate those who are incarcerated. Individuals are released back into society, leaving people with mental illness more problematic before. Dr. Stuart Grayson from Harvard University discovered roughly one-third of prisoners in solitary confinement are actively psychotic or suicidal. A 16-year-old named Khalif Browder was found guilty for theft of a backpack. After fighting with prisoners and officers, Browder was placed in solitary confinement 17 months in a 3-year sentence. After finishing his sentence at 20 years old, and after the 5th attempt, Browder committed suicide. Browder's mother believed solitary confinement is what destroyed her son. It should be known half of the studies recorded in prison suicides are in solitary confinement. One of the misconceptions is segregated housing is used only for brief periods of time. Correction officials can easily move inmates from short-term disciplinary seg to long-term admin seg by simply reclassification. In 2009, the average stay in Supermax in Illinois was more than 6 years. In 2011, the average stay in Washington was 11 months, and in Texas, the average stay is almost 4 years. The findings of this examination often surprises most correctional officials, whom agree that nobody should stay in SAG longer than what it takes to achieve disciplinary goals. Some of the recommendations by the UN: the USA approved the United Nations Convention and the Internal Covenant on the Civil and Political Rights Report. The report recommends the following for the use of confinement. All institutions should ensure that solitary or isolated confinement, whether imposed for admin or disciplinary purposes, is imposed only as long as resort for the minimum period possible. No prisoner should be held in prolonged or indefinite isolation. All prisoners in SAG confinement should have access to meaningful therapeutic, educational, and rehabilitation programs. Conditional in all SAG facilities should provide minimum standards for a humane environment so that prisoners, even in the most restrictive settings, have adequate facilities for outdoor exercise, access to natural light, and meaningful human contact both with the facility and the outside world. Children, that is, those under 18, should never be held in solitary confinement. All youthful offenders should receive treatment appropriate to their age and developmental needs, with the primary goal of rehabilitation as required under international standards. No prisoner with mental illness, mental disabilities, or severe behavioral disorders, or who is identified as being at risk of developing these conditions should be held in solitary confinement. There should be regular external review of conditions in SAG facilities and of those procedures and operation of such facilities. I've shared a couple YouTube links The first video below is inmate Brett Collins. He explains what 5 years in solitary confinement did to him as a person. And second, the video link is Sarah Shord. She explains the effects of solitary confinement, what it did to her mentally for 410 days. And the third video is David Engelman explaining the effects on the brain caused by solitary confinement. Some of the videos will kind of open up your eyes on how this can be cruel and unusual. But this pretty much concludes our presentation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.